I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. When we recorded this conversation with Margaret Heffernan, we expected to release just one episode, but she shared so many valuable insights that the team couldn't find a way to cut it down to a single episode without losing some gold material. So we've split it into two parts. In this first episode, you'll hear the beginning of our discussion. Part 2 will follow next week. I hope you enjoy it as much as we have. Today's guest, Dr. Margaret Heffernan, is an author and thought leader on business leadership and decision-making, whose TED Talks have been seen by over 50 million people. She produced programs for the BBC for 13 years, including radio and television dramas and documentaries, and was the first producer to put Simon Sharma on TV. Margaret has been Chief Executive of InfoMation Corporation, ZineZone Corporation, and iCast Corporation. She is a Professor of Practice at the University of Bath and mentors senior executives through Merrick & Co. Her work focuses on how leaders and organizations can embrace uncertainty, question the status quo, and make more informed decisions. Margaret is the author of 7 books, including Wilful Blindness, named by the Financial Times as one of the most important business books of the decade, Uncharted and Embracing Uncertainty, and has advised the Casey Review and the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. She was inducted into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame in 2024. Margaret, a huge welcome and thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Margaret, I'd love to jump into exploring your work around embracing uncertainty. In episodes 85 to 86 of Enter the Boardroom, Dan Gardner, the author of Super Forecasting and How Big Things Get Done, articulated how boards can project more intelligently into the future using probabilistic thinking. In Embracing Uncertainty, you share a number of concepts that strike me as really relevant to how boards operate. For example, you highlight how artists, musicians and scientists work well together without knowing the outcome. But I'd love to hear what have been your key insights about operating and embracing uncertainty that might be helpful to our listeners who are sitting on boards facing uncertainty today, as so many are.
I guess my first insight is that most people regard uncertainty as mad, bad, evil, and dangerous, and something to be eliminated. And so what that says to me is that it makes them very anxious. And very frequently what that means is they will rush to some form of certainty, which will convince them that the uncertainty's gone and everything's okay. And the difficulty with that is that if you rush to a strategy, for example, or an approach or a product or whatever it may be, or a hire, what's going to make you feel most comfortable is what you've done in the past. And it'll feel comfortable because it's familiar, but it won't necessarily be right. So we tend to repeat kinds of decisions because we think, well, this looks a little bit like that. So a lot of decision-making and analysis done by analogy, which shuts off the opportunity to explore, okay, what is really different now? Historians don't believe that history repeats itself for the kind of obvious reason that the people making decisions now know things and have had experiences that the people in the past didn't know and hadn't had. So they have different information and as a consequence make different decisions. the making of decisions by analogy is fantastically dangerous. I mean, one kind of poster child for this is the United States government always referring to the war in Vietnam as being a bit like Munich, that we have to protect Vietnam because otherwise the whole of Southeast Asia will be overrun by China. Only many years later did Robert McNamara concede that actually in making this decision, really nobody in the cabinet knew anything about China. And what they certainly did not know was how viscerally and for how many centuries the Vietnamese had hated China and would never give in to them. So analogies with the past eliminate our anxiety and they give us a degree that certainty has returned. But that's very often delusional or willful blindness. So the dislike and discomfort with uncertainty, I think, easily forces people into poor, shallow thinking. Instead of taking the time and learning to tolerate the ambiguity of the situation in order really deeply to understand what is it that's really happening right now.
That's really interesting. I guess one of the reasons people feel uncomfortable with uncertainty is they feel pressured into making a decision. They feel there's a limited amount of time to make a decision, and that's why they're sort of leaping to things that give them a false friend of direction. Can you bring that to life for me with examples where I guess the implication is you're saying people have more time than they think. And I see that often in the sports world where the most gifted players seem to have more time than everyone else, which of course they don't, but they create that illusion. Is that where your thinking goes?
Well, it's a little bit like that. I mean, I think, first of all, people are made so anxious by uncertainty that they shorten the time that they think is available to them. They're doing this to put themselves out of pain, essentially. And that's because they have a wholly negative view of uncertainty. And I think often a misplaced faith that they can impose certainty in situations where quite often they can't. I mean, on one level, if you think about it, almost every aspect of life is uncertain. I was teaching at the university today, and I drove home. I didn't have much of a margin of error for the time in which to get home. All it really needed was for some kid to run across the street or for a car to run into them, and I wouldn't have got home on time. That's true for almost everything we do. So we have an illusion that somehow when we leave the university and we get home on time, that's all us. That's our fantastic planning. Actually, it's just kind of luck and statistical probabilities. It's not us, really. I live in the countryside. I frequently am going to trains and everything is on time, and then some farmer decides to walk his sheep across the road. So I think we have an absolutely inflated sense of how much certainty there actually is in real life. And so when we feel that suddenly that's gone away, we get a great sense of anxiety and we have a deep desire to shut it down. And so we rush into decision making. And the fastest decision to make is to reach for something that worked before. In many cases, there's more time. I would say there's always more time for a good decision than for a bad one. And I think the rush is just psychic discomfort. One of the questions I frequently ask in board meetings has always been, how much of this decision do we have to make today? There's a huge desire often to come up with the perfect solution for everything, instead of thinking, actually, maybe we need to deal with one piece of this and then spend a little bit more time thinking about what comes next. But of course, boards are full of people who tend to be quite action-oriented. They want to make decisions because that's what boards do. I think a lot of poor decision-making comes out of making too much too fast, a panic, which means I want to shut down the uncertainty, a desire for simplicity, which may be a deep false friend, a desire to create some kind of sense of harmony, which means if we can all agree on something that we've all done before, we're likely all to start feeling better quickly. I think also, and I wrote about this quite a lot in Wilful Blindness, most people really don't like conflict. And as a consequence, they want to shut it down. It's not like I like picking a fight, but I do absolutely recognize from all the work that I've done in different industries that conflict is basically how poor decisions or choices are made better. Pixar, they have this kind of mantra, in the beginning, all our movies suck, right? Good ideas don't start fully formed and perfect. They start with, I wonder what would happen if. And then you have a lot of debate and disagreement and reflection time, hopefully. And with any luck, you end up making a decision that's far better than the first ready-made, possibly quite stale one was.
Trying to reconcile in my head, in episode 125, we had Elena Botelho referencing the research she's done that suggests that the highest performing CEOs stand out in 4 areas that she calls the DARE model. One of those is the D, the decisiveness. The CEOs who are decisive do better. How does that square with what you're saying here, which is that actually taking more time is often the right answer?
Well, being decisive doesn't necessarily mean being quick. It means making good decisions. And that may not mean instantaneously. In fact, I think it rarely does. The fastest decision is the one with the least amount of conscious thought. Those are easy to make. But of all the CEOs and all the boards I've sat on, I wouldn't say the most outstanding were the fastest by any manner of means. Now we're into move fast and break things territory. Any fool can make a fast decision. That's not what you want in a board. You want a board that can make good decisions. You want a board where there is a healthy degree of disagreement so you can explore options. You want a board where people do reflect after the decision and let you know if something's occurred to them that might challenge decision. And a number of the best boards I've sat on, if they have had really important decisions to make, will engineer a cooling off period so that, within 24 hours, if they have different views of it, they can say something about it. It's very well understood neurologically that after you make a decision, different parts of your brain continue to work on it. And that's often the moment where you're driving home and suddenly remember an absolutely crucial fact or see a risk in a completely different way. So if by decisiveness you mean making decisions quickly, I would challenge that. I would say it would be making decisions in an appropriate time scale. And some decisions take a very long time, and some decisions can be made quickly. But I would never say in any context that the best decisions are made fast. In fact, I would say I've seen a lot of decisions made too fast. And that's because everybody agreed, and now we're into groupthink. And the thing everybody forgets about groupthink is not just the problem is everybody's thinking the same thing. The key element in Janice's theory is that it amplifies the appetite for risk. So we may be about to make a good decision, but because we all agree, we want to make it faster or bigger. And that's where you really get into trouble. So I guess, I'm being a little pedantic here. I would like to know what is meant by decisiveness. If it means that a good board is characterized by very sound decision-making and very good decision-making processes, that must be unarguable. Because no good board is defined by anything but that, right?
Talk to me more about that cooling off period, which I'm intrigued by. What, in your mind, does a great decision-making process by a board look like? And I'm interested in how that interplays with another of the heuristics that you wrote about of this just-in-case thinking versus just-in-time thinking, which embraces strategic resilience over predictive planning.
Yeah. I think a good decision-making process is one where everybody really understands the problem or the opportunity. Everybody's really read and understood the detail. There's been enough time to explore all of that so that people have an agreed view of actually what the choices are and what the consequence of each choice are. There has been a healthy amount of disagreement, which has not been personal, where there has been a significant diversity of voices where nobody dominated. So it wasn't the CEO leading everybody down a predetermined path, where there's a recognition of the quality of risk or uncertainty that nevertheless remains endemic to the decision. So nobody who thinks, right, well, now we've made the decision, that's it. Because that's not it. That's the beginning of the next process, which is about keeping eyes and ears very attuned to whether the decision is working out the way we expected it to. Because every decision is a hypothesis. We think if we do the following things, we will get the following outcomes. And what follows the decision has to be a close monitoring of, is that hypothesis playing out the way that we expect it? Because if it isn't, the sooner we notice, the better. We may still not change our mind, but we need to keep front of mind the assumptions on which our decision was based and ask ourselves, are they still safe? Because in a world where so little can be predicted with accuracy, many of those decisions may turn out not to be safe. You know, you could easily have been running General Mills and making breakfast cereal and made a decision, which was, of course, you're going to carry on making them in the same way, completely oblivious to the fact that 2 weeks later, the Ukraine war is going to break out and almost all of your cereals are going to have to be reformulated because you can't get hold of enough wheat from your traditional supply chain. So what that means is a decision isn't finished the day you make it, right? It remains a live thing that you have to keep looking at to make sure that the assumptions you made are still safe. So I think of the process as starting quite early and going on for a significant period of time.
For many board members, the first role comes easier than the second or third. New Role Plus gives you personal expert feedback to help you move up, sharpening your proposition, keeping you credible on current topics, and connecting you to more prestigious board roles. Head to plus.newrole.com to find out more. That's really powerful, because I guess one of the things that really frustrates CEOs and organizations is when they feel a board is flip-flopping on a decision. And it's the same with executives. And if you've laid it out in the way that you've just articulated, where everyone is clear on the assumptions, the facts have changed, and therefore everybody is clear on why the decision is changing. Is there ever a time when, as a board, you need to draw a line on a decision and say, look, we just have to commit on that, because otherwise we're going to be flip-flopping forever, and actually that creates so much chaos through the organization that it's not worth it? It's better. You sometimes hear people make the phrase, a bad decision is better than no decision.
Well, no decision is a decision, right? I mean, not making a decision is a decision. So there's always a decision, right? The thing I'm much more alert to is the number of decisions that go wrong because of deal momentum. I see this over and over again. We've started, so we'll finish. We said we'd do it. We have to hit the deadline. If we don't, this competitor will come and take this precious deal off the table. All of these sorts of things lead people into some really terrible decisions because they think, I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going. The momentum. I mean, you see this most of all in M&A. You can't help but think, okay, so if the failure rate is, depending on whose research you're quoting, 50 to 80%. Well, there's something about this. We've started, so we'll finish. We've got to work through the night. We've got to get it done, which I think is at least questionable. Not least the fact that once you've worked through a night or two, your brain is really not functioning at all. So yeah, you have a lot of really decisive people who are no longer in a cognitive position to think. So I don't think you can always manage the timing of these things. I appreciate that very often these are competitive situations. But I don't think I can remember sitting through any sort of M&A transaction that at some point didn't become hysterical on some level. And that's partly because everybody was too tired to think. But also there's just this sort of momentum behind them, which has something to do, I'm sure, with the failure rate, which is that they don't achieve the strategic aim for which they were designed. So it's not that I think, I'm astounding to very, very negative here. And I've also seen boards make really excellent decisions. I just think there are a whole bunch of unconscious beliefs, like we have to do it fast. We have to build consensus. We have to do it all in one go. It's a sort of race to the finish. Doubt is bad, of which I see absolutely no reason to subscribe to.
Is that cooling off period? Is there a rough rule of thumb you have when you see, the 80-20 benefit of it, that after 2 weeks, your subconscious or the collective subconscious will have done most of its useful revisiting? Or so for a chair listening to this who's thinking about, gosh, for Margaret, that's a fascinating idea. I'm going to build in some cooling off periods to the decisions we have in our board. How long should that be? Is it a week? Is it a day? Is it a month?
I think it depends hugely on the scale and impact of the proposed strategy or deal. In some cases, it may be a day. In some cases, it may be a weekend. But we do know neurologically that once you've made a decision, it kind of moves to a different part of your brain. I've lost count of the number of times I've left a boardroom, everybody thought, right, that's it. And then somebody said, hang on a second, what about? So I don't think it has to be an enormously long period of time. But I do think it's a very easy, and compared to the cost of risk, very cheap way to feel a little bit more secure in what you've done.
It's really interesting because I think a lot of boards look down on that someone brings something up afterwards and the feeling is, well, why didn't you bring that up at the time? And what you're saying there around the neurology of it is actually perhaps they couldn't have brought that up at the time. So that's why it's really important to have that cool down period.
Exactly.
Talk to me about deep hanging out, which is a concept I absolutely loved. It sounds hugely unproductive at first glance, but it made me feel much better because I feel like I'm sometimes doing deep hanging out. But I'm curious to hear how you think board members should think about that and what they should be looking for in a CEO to be able to distinguish when deep hanging out is being productive versus actually just slacking.
Deep hanging out is essentially spending a significant chunk of time in the world, not in the boardroom. Maybe visiting offices of the company, visiting places where your business partners, customers, suppliers hang out, having fairly unstructured conversations and trying to pick up and sense the mood of the moment, the mood of the market. Deep hanging out, a concept I first learned about from Andy Haldane when he was chief economist at the Bank of England. It's something that he used to do, particularly when decisions were coming up about changing interest rates. He would hang out with people who were not bankers to get a sense of the mood of the country. How did the economy feel as opposed to what the data said? It would be wrong to say that he wasn't paying attention to the data. Of course he was. But it's about providing a sense of what's the context in which these decisions are being made. And if you have a sense of the context, do they seem to make sense in that context or not? Because the data will tell you a lot, but it won't tell you everything. I would argue that one reason the Democrats lost the most recent election is they were very, very data savvy. They certainly could read the data on the economy, which looked, fine. Well, what they weren't doing is paying any attention to what it actually felt like to be living and working in that economy, for having brought inflation down. But that isn't the same as living in a place at a time when all the prices have gone up and aren't going down. They're just staying put. So being able to feel what that looks like versus being able to see, oh, it's great, inflation's no longer going up. The distinction between those two things in terms of lived experience is gigantic. It's absolutely gigantic.
And so for a board member thinking about the implications for them, is the message to get out of the boardroom more, to spend more time exposed to more diverse sources, to make sure you're triangulating against the data that you're getting in the boardroom?
Definitely. Definitely. And to be asking yourself, do the numbers make sense with what I'm seeing and hearing and feeling? And, if in many cases, the answer will be yes. This is very coherent. But if it isn't, you should pay attention to it. You should absolutely pay attention to it. I can remember sitting on a board and things seemed absolutely fine. And yet if I went and hung out in the kitchen of the company and chatted to people who worked there, that wasn't what I heard. This was a company which had been set up by a very brilliant founder. The founder had recently died, so the company was in some form of mourning. At the board level, there was a feeling that what we need to do is just keep the ship steady, keep a good eye on the revenue line, and just look after people and make sure that they don't, they're not too upset by the loss of this beloved founder. In the kitchen, people were actually terrified that the board was acting as if everything was fine, because they were looking at the revenue line and thinking these were all the founder's best friends and clients. This is not safe. Why aren't they talking about it? We should be doing something. I'd be happy to be doing something, but nobody's asked me to do anything. So you had what I describe as a mutually assured stalemate, which is half of the business thought, well, let's just keep calm. And the other half of the business was thinking, no, don't keep calm, please. Panic now, because if you panic too late, we're sunk. Recognizing the delta between those two positions is super helpful.
One of the other concepts that really made me think from Embracing Uncertainty was creating the time to let your mind wander, and what happens there. Actually, we've got our offsite coming up, and one of the lessons we've learned over history is less is more. The less we structure it, the better it becomes, because suddenly things come out that you just can't plan for. Really interested to hear how you think about that in the boardroom, because I think it takes a really brave chair to have an agenda where there's just a blank space and to allow the conversation to wander. And what my experience is, often the first 80% of a conversation that wanders, you think we're wasting our time. And then somehow at the end, in that last 20%, it all comes together. But you couldn't have gone straight to that point, and you wouldn't have got there had you tried.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's interesting because when I interviewed Andy Haldane for the book, and I don't know if this made it into the book or not, but, he talked about having agenda-free meetings so that the things that were really on people's minds would eventually bubble up. And he said for somebody who's very orderly and significantly an introvert, this is how he described himself, this is very difficult. But it meant that things that were on people's minds absolutely did come up. And it takes a little bit of wandering around to figure out what it is that's really on everybody's mind. My experience is that frequently this happens in the private session after executives have left. That's when it most often comes up. And part of that is because there's a deep dislike of challenging executives in the board meeting if you haven't warned them you're going to do that, which I just as a matter of politeness. But there's also, again, this fear of conflict and lack of knowledge about how to do conflict well. But I do think, it's so funny. I've had 2 meetings this week and I've come away from both of them thinking they're using very old agendas and they're just recycling it and it needs a big refresh. I also tend to think that as far as offsites are concerned, I agree with you completely. And I just spoke at an offsite for a private equity company, and they kicked off their offsite by saying, okay, you guys said you wanted less structured time, so that's why we now have a much less structured agenda. So I think this is quite a common finding at the moment. And part of it must surely be in response to the fact that since so much now is done online, those meetings are very structured, partly due to the fact that there's a clock in the corner of the screen that everybody has. So people are much more conscious of time passing than they are in the boardroom, where they may not. It just isn't so front of mind. But off-sites are one thing because people expect those to be different. Personally, my own preference, I guess, is I quite like a good slug of information I haven't been exposed to before. So I think of that as protein. And then I'd like having some less structured time with which to explore it with my colleagues. So I like to have something pretty meaty to chew on. And even if the protein isn't the most important thing, it'll get us to the most important thing. So I guess I'm a little bit on the fence, which is if there's no agenda and I'm not learning anything, then I get a bit antsy because I didn't quite come to relax. But I do totally agree that if you overstructure it, people lose interest and you're unlikely to have pinpointed everything they want to talk about. You need some of those ideas to have time and space in which to emerge.
Can you bring that to life for me with an example of where, even if you haven't prepared the most important materials, you will eventually get there?
Yeah. So I'm thinking about a company on whose board I sit. Of course, we're thinking a lot about AI. So a lot of the conversation is about AI. And actually, in the midst of the conversation about AI, there's quite a big download at the beginning of this discussion in terms of the state of the technology, what the company's implementing and what it's not implementing, and what are the ethical codes that they are seeking to abide by. What eventually emerges is a very difficult discussion about treatment of intellectual property. Intellectual property wasn't on the agenda, but we end up in this place where the issues are extremely knotty. There's quite a lot of vigorous disagreement. And we thought we were talking about the technology, but actually we're not talking about the technology. We're talking about our IP. We're talking about the IP of other IP creators. We're talking about what is our legal position on this. We're talking about government regulation. And that wasn't what we thought we were talking about. But on the other hand, I think everybody realized this is a conversation we really need to have. And probably we should have had it last quarter.
I suppose what would worry me if I were the chair or the CEO on that is it might have surfaced something, but perhaps is not the thing that's highest priority on my agenda list. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, I think you have to make a position, which is you may say, actually, this is really important. It isn't urgent, and we should make some time for it next time. I'm sure many boards have had, on some of the boards I sit on, endless discussions about working from home. And we've made decisions, and then we've come back to it. And in this case, I'm very glad that the chair has said, look, we made a decision. Let's see how the decision plays out. Let's give this 6 months, and then let's revisit it. But let's not revisit it every quarter, because there's no new information. And we made a decision, so let's just stick to it. We're not happy with this decision, but we were happy with it to begin with. And coming back to your issue around flip-flopping, it's not flip-flopping if the facts have changed. But if the facts haven't changed, then why are we having this conversation? We're having it because somebody isn't happy with it. But that's too bad. We made the decision. We all agreed. We need to live with it. And then we need to check in to see, are things going better or going worse? If there's no data to say there's a problem, we can't afford to spend precious time on this.
If you're ready to move beyond your first few roles and build the plural career you want, with expert support beside you, Neural Plus gives you the guidance to get there. As a listener, you get 10% off. Head to plus.neural.com and use the code ENTER at checkout.